The package arrived 6 weeks after my wedding, exactly when the videographer had promised. A beautiful white box with gold lettering that said, "Emma and James, forever begins now." And inside was a USB drive with our wedding video. The professionally edited highlights reel I'd paid $3,000 for. And tucked underneath was a second USB drive labeled raw footage. "Please watch alone first," with a handwritten note from Rebecca, the videographer, that said, "Emma, I'm so sorry, but there's something on the raw footage you need to hear before you watch the final edit. I debated whether to tell you, but I couldn't let you live with this without knowing. Please watch this alone and call me if you need to talk." And I stood in my kitchen holding this note, feeling my stomach drop because the tone was wrong, was too serious, was the kind of serious that meant bad news was coming. I should have called James over, should have opened it with my husband of 6 weeks, but something in Rebecca's note made me wait, made me take my laptop to the bedroom and close the door and plug in the drive labeled raw footage. And the folder had hundreds of files, hours and hours of unedited ceremony and reception footage. And I didn't know where to start until I saw one file highlighted in red labeled Audio Ceremony Vows, ENHANCED. And I clicked on it with hands that had started shaking without me understanding why. The video opened on a wide shot of our ceremony, me standing at the altar across from James, the officiant talking about love and commitment, everything looking exactly as I remembered it, beautiful and perfect, and everything I dreamed my wedding would be. And I was about to skip ahead wondering what Rebecca wanted me to hear when I noticed the audio meter spiking even though no one was talking on camera. And I turned up my volume and heard voices, female voices, whispering. And I realized the microphones had picked up conversations from the front row, from my bridesmaids who were standing beside me, and I heard my maid of honor, Catherine, whisper to my sister, Sarah, "I can't believe we're actually here. I keep thinking someone's going to stop this." And Sarah whispered back, "I know, I feel sick. Should we have told her?" And Catherine said, "Told her what? That we've known for 6 months. That would just make us look worse. At least this way she gets the wedding she wanted." And Sarah said, "But she's marrying him. She's actually marrying him and she has no idea." And Catherine said, "Maybe she's better off not knowing. Maybe ignorance is bliss, at least until the honeymoon is over." I paused the video and sat there trying to process what I just heard, trying to understand what my maid of honor and my sister were talking about, what they'd known for 6 months that they hadn't told me. And I felt this creeping dread because the way they were talking implied something big, something that would have made me cancel the wedding if I'd known. And I pressed play again and heard more whispering, my bridesmaid Ashley saying, "Do you think Jennifer is here? Is she watching this happen?" And Catherine said, "She better not be. If I see her, I'm going to lose it. The audacity to show up to the wedding of the woman whose life you're ruining." And Sarah said, "Keep your voice down. Emma might hear you." And Catherine said, "She's not hearing anything. She's so happy right now. Look at her face. She thinks this is the best day of her life." And Ashley said, "It is the best day of her life, and we're standing here knowing it's all a lie. I feel like I'm going to throw up." I stopped the video again, and this time I did feel like I was going to throw up because they were talking about someone named Jennifer, talking about her ruining my life. And I didn't know anyone named Jennifer, had never heard James mention anyone by that name. And I tried to remember if any of my bridesmaids had talked about a Jennifer, but I came up blank. And I went back to the video and skipped ahead to the vows, to the part where James was promising to love me forever. And I watched myself crying happy tears while in the background I could hear Catherine whisper, "He's really doing this. He's really saying these vows while she's probably watching at home." And Sarah whispered back, "Or at work. Doesn't she work at the hospital downtown?" And Catherine said, "I don't know and I don't care. All I know is Emma deserves better than this and we should have told her months ago." I closed the laptop and sat there in my bedroom trying to breathe, trying to understand what I'd just learned. And the pieces weren't fitting together, but they were forming a shape I didn't like. My bridesmaids and my sister knew something about James, something involving a woman named Jennifer, something they thought should have made me cancel the wedding, and they'd kept it secret for at least 6 months, had stood beside me at the altar knowing something that would destroy me and said nothing. And I felt betrayed twice over, once by whatever James had done, and once by the women I trusted most in the world who'd watched me walk into a marriage they knew was built on lies. I opened the laptop again, and went back to the raw footage folder and found files from the reception, from the speeches and the dancing and the cake cutting. And I found one labeled SBECHES Best Man Raw, and I clicked on it because I needed to know more, needed to understand what everyone apparently knew except me. And the video showed James's best man Marcus giving his speech, the one I remembered being funny and sweet, but this version had more footage before and after. And I saw Marcus at his table before the speech started, talking to the other groomsmen, and one of them said, "Are you really going to give the speech without mentioning it?" And Marcus said, "What am I supposed to say? My best friend is a lying cheater who's been with another woman for 2 years. Congratulations, Emma, on marrying someone who's going to break your heart. No, I'm giving the safe speech, the one that makes everyone smile." 2 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. James had been with another woman for 2 years, which meant our entire engagement, which meant he'd been cheating on me when he proposed, when we picked out rings, when we planned this wedding, when we said our vows 6 weeks ago. And I felt the room spin because our relationship had been 3 years total, which meant he'd been with Jennifer for 2/3 of our relationship, and I'd had no idea. Had trusted him completely, while apparently everyone in my life knew he was betraying me, and no one had said a word. I kept watching the raw footage and found a section from late in the reception, after most of the guests had left, and I saw Catherine and Sarah sitting at a table with my mom, and my mom was saying, "I think we made the right choice not telling her. Look how happy she is. This was her dream wedding." And Catherine said, "But what about when she finds out? What about when Jennifer gets tired of being the secret and tells her? We're going to look like we were complicit." And my mom said, "Jennifer isn't going to tell her anything. She's been the other woman for 2 years. If she was going to make a scene, she would have done it by now." And Sarah said, "I just feel guilty. Every time Emma talks about how perfect James is, I want to scream the truth at her." My own mother knew. My mother had known James was cheating on me and had actively participated in keeping it secret, had helped my bridesmaids decide not to tell me, had stood beside me at my wedding knowing I was marrying a cheater, and I felt something break inside me that I didn't know could break, because your mother is supposed to protect you, supposed to warn you when you're making a mistake, and instead she'd watched me walk down the aisle toward a man who was betraying me, and she'd smiled and cried happy tears and said nothing. I spent the next hour going through every file in the raw footage folder, listening to whispered conversations caught on hot mics, and I pieced together the story that everyone knew except me. James had been having an affair with a woman named Jennifer who worked at the hospital downtown. They'd been together for 2 years. Jennifer thought James was going to leave me for her. My bridesmaids had found out 6 months before the wedding when someone saw James with Jennifer at a restaurant. They'd told my mom and my sister, and they'd all decided together not to tell me because the wedding was already planned and the deposits were paid, and they thought maybe the affair would end after we got married, thought maybe marriage would make James faithful, and they'd gambled with my life and my future and lost. I called Rebecca, the videographer, and she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting, and she said, "Emma, I'm so sorry." I went back and forth about whether to send you that footage, but I couldn't in good conscience let you not know. And I said, "How much did you hear? How much is on the footage?" And she said, "Enough to understand that your husband has been unfaithful and that your wedding party knew about it." I caught conversations during the ceremony, during the reception, during the preparation time when I was filming the bridesmaids getting ready. They talked about it constantly when they thought no one was listening. And my microphones picked up everything. I asked her why she was telling me now, why she'd waited 6 weeks, and she said, "I needed time to go through all the footage, to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding what I was hearing. And then I struggled with whether to tell you because I know it's going to destroy your happiness. But I'm a woman, and if my husband was cheating on me, I'd want someone to tell me, and I couldn't live with myself knowing and staying silent like everyone else in your life apparently did." I thanked Rebecca and hung up and sat there trying to decide what to do next, and part of me wanted to confront James immediately, wanted to play him the raw footage and watch his face when he realized he'd been caught, but another part of me needed more information first, needed to understand the full scope of the betrayal before I showed my hand. I opened my laptop and searched for Jennifer at the downtown hospital. Didn't know her last name, but figured there couldn't be that many Jennifers working there. and I found the hospital's staff directory and searched and found 3 Jennifers. And I looked at their photos, and one of them made my stomach turn because I recognized her, had seen her before somewhere. And I searched my memory and realized she'd been at one of James's work events that I'd attended about a year ago. A charity fundraiser the hospital had hosted, and I remembered James introducing her as a colleague, someone from the nursing staff, and I remembered thinking she'd looked at James a little too long, a little too warmly, but I dismissed it as me being paranoid, and now I understood that look had been intimate, had been the look of a woman who was sleeping with my boyfriend. Jennifer Morrison. Her name was Jennifer Morrison, and she was a nurse in the cardiac unit. And I clicked through to her personal Facebook page, which was set to private, but had a public profile photo. And in that photo, she was smiling at the camera wearing scrubs and looking completely normal, looking like someone who wouldn't intentionally destroy another woman's life. And I felt rage building because this woman had been with my husband for 2 years, had known about me the whole time, had probably known we were getting married and had done nothing to stop it. And I wondered what James had told her, what lies he'd fed her to keep her waiting, to keep her believing he'd leave me eventually. I created a fake Facebook account, wanted to see if I could access more of Jennifer's profile, and I sent her a friend request from this fake account pretending to be someone from her nursing school. And within an hour she'd accepted, and I scrolled through her photos going back 2 years. And there were pictures of her and James everywhere, at restaurants, at parks, at what looked like weekend trips. And the dates on these photos corresponded with times James had told me he was traveling for work conferences or visiting his sick grandmother. And every lie he'd told me was documented here in Jennifer's photo albums. Proof that while I was home alone trusting him completely, he was building an entire second life with another woman. I found photos from my wedding day. Jennifer had posted a cryptic message that said, "Sometimes the hardest thing is watching someone you love choose someone else. But if it's meant to be, it will find its way back." And in the comments, her friends were supporting her, saying things like, "Stay strong, girl. He'll realize what he lost. And you deserve better than to be second choice." And I realized Jennifer's friends knew about the affair too, knew she was the other woman, and they were supporting her, treating her like the victim in this situation, when I was the one who'd been lied to, when I was the one who'd married someone who was in love with someone else. I took screenshots of everything, every photo, every comment, every piece of evidence that James had been living a double life, and I organized it all into a folder and tried to decide what to do next. And I thought about just leaving, just packing my things and disappearing while James was at work, leaving him a note that said I knew everything and never contacting him again. But that felt too easy for him, felt like he'd get to play the victim. Tell people I'd abandoned him without explanation, and I wanted him to face what he'd done, wanted everyone who'd kept his secret to face what they'd enabled. James came home from work that evening and found me sitting in our living room with my laptop, and he said, "Hey babe, what are you watching?" And I said, "Our wedding video, the raw footage. Rebecca sent both versions." And I watched his face carefully, but he didn't react, just said, "That's cool, can I see?" And I said, "Sure, come watch this part." And I played him the audio from the ceremony, the part where my bridesmaids were whispering about Jennifer. And I watched the color drain from his face as he realized what he was hearing. And he said, "Emma, I can explain." And I said, "Explain what exactly? Explain that you've been cheating on me for 2 years. Explain that everyone at our wedding knew except me. Explain that you said vows you had no intention of keeping." And he sat down heavily and put his head in his hands, and I felt nothing, no sympathy, no urge to comfort him, just cold rage that he'd done this to me. James tried to tell me that the affair was over, that he'd ended things with Jennifer before the wedding, that he'd chosen me and wanted to make our marriage work. And I pulled up the Facebook photos and showed him pictures from 2 weeks ago, pictures of him and Jennifer at a coffee shop. And I said, "This was during our honeymoon week. You told me you had to go into the office for a few hours, but you were with her." And he couldn't deny it. The evidence was there in Jennifer's photos. And he said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me. I love you, but I love her too, and I don't know how to choose." And hearing him say he loved her destroyed something in me because I'd thought our marriage meant he'd chosen me, thought the wedding was him declaring to the world that I was the one he wanted. But apparently even marriage wasn't enough to make him let her go. I asked him when it started, and he said 2 years ago. They'd met at a hospital charity event, the same event where he'd introduced me to her months later, pretending she was just a colleague. And they'd connected immediately and started texting, and one thing led to another, and before he knew it, he was in a full relationship with her. And I said, before you knew it, like you had no control, like you didn't make the conscious choice every single day for 2 years to lie to me. And he said he knew there was no excuse, knew he'd destroyed my trust, but he wanted to try to save our marriage if I'd let him. I asked him what he'd told Jennifer about me, what lies he'd fed her to keep her waiting, and he said he'd told her that we were already engaged when he met her, that it was complicated, that he was trying to figure out how to break up with me without devastating me, and Jennifer had been patient, had believed he'd leave me eventually. And when I asked if he'd ever actually planned to leave me for her, he said he didn't know. He'd gone back and forth constantly. Some days, sure, he wanted to be with Jennifer, and other days, sure, he wanted to be with me. And he'd convinced himself he could keep both of us happy, keep both relationships going indefinitely. I asked him about the wedding, whether he'd considered calling it off, whether he'd told Jennifer he was getting married, and he said Jennifer had known about the wedding, had cried and begged him not to go through with it, and he'd promised her it was just a formality, that marriage didn't change anything, that he'd still be with her. And I realized that while I was exchanging vows with James, Jennifer was probably home heartbroken, thinking the man she loved was marrying someone else. And even though she'd knowingly been with a taken man, I felt a twisted sympathy for her because James had lied to both of us, had made us both believe we were the one he wanted. I asked James if he'd slept with Jennifer during our engagement, and he said yes, regularly. And I asked if he'd slept with her during our marriage, and he said yes, twice already. And I felt physically sick, because I'd been sharing a bed with my husband while he was sharing his body with another woman. And the intimacy we'd had on our wedding night and on our honeymoon had been contaminated by the fact that he was still actively involved with someone else. I told James to get out, to pack a bag and leave, and he said, Emma, please, can we talk about this? Can we try counseling? And I said, counseling is for people who want to save their marriage. I want mine annulled. I want to pretend it never happened. And he looked shocked and said, annulled? You can't be serious. We've been married 6 weeks. And I said, exactly, 6 weeks, barely enough time to count. And I have grounds for annulment because you entered the marriage fraudulently. You were already in a relationship with someone else. You had no intention of being faithful. That's fraud. And he said, I did intend to be faithful. I wanted to end things with Jennifer. And I said, but you didn't. You slept with her twice in 6 weeks. That's not trying to end things. That's maintaining a relationship. And he couldn't argue with that, so he just sat there looking defeated. I asked him if anyone else knew about the affair besides the people at the wedding, and he said his best man, Marcus, knew obviously, and a few of his friends from work, but he thought he'd kept it pretty contained. And I said, kept it contained? Half the people at our wedding knew I was marrying a cheater, and no one told me. Do you understand how humiliating that is? Do you understand that I stood up there saying vows while people pitied me? And he said he didn't know my bridesmaids knew. Didn't know my family knew. And I said, well, they did. They've known for 6 months and they kept your secret. They protected you instead of protecting me. And I felt rage at all of them, at James for lying and at everyone else for enabling him. James packed a bag, and before he left he said, I love you, Emma. I know I've destroyed everything, but I do love you. And I said, you don't get to say that anymore. You don't get to use that word after what you've done. And he left, and I was alone in the apartment we'd moved into together as newlyweds, surrounded by wedding gifts we hadn't finished opening and photos from a wedding that now felt like a cruel joke. I called Catherine, and when she answered, I said, I know about Jennifer. I know you've known for 6 months. I know you all decided together not to tell me. And there was silence on the other end, and then she said, Emma, I'm so sorry. We wanted to tell you, but we didn't know how. And I said, how about Emma? James is cheating on you. That's literally all you had to say. And she said, it's more complicated than that. And I said, no, it's not. You chose to protect him instead of me. You chose to let me marry someone you knew was betraying me, and I will never forgive you for that. And I hung up before she could respond. I called my sister next, and she answered crying and said, Emma, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, we should have told you. And I said, yes, you should have. You're my sister, you're supposed to have my back. And instead you stood beside me at my wedding knowing I was making a mistake and you said nothing. And she said, we thought maybe he'd end it, thought maybe getting married would fix him. And I said, getting married doesn't fix cheaters. It just makes them married cheaters, and you gambled with my life. And she said, I know. I know, and I'll never forgive myself. And I said, good, live with that guilt because I'm done with you. I'm done with all of you. I called my mother last and she tried to justify it, said they'd been trying to protect me, didn't want to ruin my wedding, thought I'd be happier not knowing. And I said, you don't get to decide what I'm happier not knowing. You don't get to withhold information that affects my life and pretend it's for my own good. And she said, we were trying to do what was best. And I said, what was best was the truth. What was best was giving me the choice about whether to marry a cheater. And you took that choice away from me. And she started crying and said, Emma, please, don't cut me out of your life over this. And I said, you cut yourself out when you chose his secret over my well-being. And I hung up. I spent that night going through the wedding video frame by frame, watching myself smile and laugh and dance, completely oblivious to the fact that I was surrounded by people keeping devastating secrets. And I saw moments I'd missed the first time, my bridesmaids exchanging looks during the vows, my mom crying in a way that now seemed less happy and more guilty, James's best man giving a speech full of inside jokes that now felt like veiled references to the affair. And I realized the entire day had been contaminated by lies. Every smile was hiding knowledge. Every hug was tainted by deception. And the wedding I'd thought was perfect was actually a performance where everyone was acting except me. I found a lawyer Monday morning and explained the situation and asked about annulment. And she said I had grounds based on fraud, that James had entered the marriage with no intention of being faithful and had actively maintained another relationship. And we could file immediately, and I said do it. I don't want to be married to him another day longer than necessary. The lawyer warned me it might not be quick, that James could contest it, but she'd seen similar cases and most of them settled because the cheating spouse didn't want the details made public. And I said make it as public as necessary. I don't care who knows what he did. I'm not protecting him anymore. I filed for annulment that week and the papers were served to James at work. And he called me crying, begging me to reconsider, saying he'd do anything to save our marriage. And I said, there's nothing to save. It was never real. You were with her the whole time. And he said, it was real to me. My feelings for you are real. And I said, real feelings don't coexist with 2 years of systematic lying. And I hung up. Jennifer reached out to me through Facebook, sent me a message that said, I know you probably hate me, but I want you to know I didn't know about the wedding until it was too late. James told me he was ending things with you, and then I saw the photos on social media and realized he'd lied to me too. And I didn't respond, didn't want to engage with her, didn't want to hear her justifications or her apologies because she'd been sleeping with my boyfriend for 2 years. She'd known he was taken, and she'd pursued him anyway, and her feelings didn't matter to me. But then she sent another message with screenshots, conversations between her and James where he was promising to leave me, telling her he loved her more, saying the wedding was a mistake he didn't know how to get out of. And I read these messages feeling sick, because while he was texting her these promises, he was texting me good morning messages and I love yous. And he'd been maintaining both relationships with apparently equal commitment, and I realized he was probably a sociopath. Someone who could lie without guilt, who could compartmentalize to the point where both relationships felt real to him. I responded to Jennifer and said, thank you for sending these. They're helpful for the annulment. And she said, I'm sorry for my part in this. I believed him when he said he was leaving you. I thought I was waiting for him to find the right time. And I said, you were sleeping with someone else's boyfriend for 2 years. You don't get to play victim. And she said, you're right. I just wanted you to know that he lied to me too. He told me you and him had problems, that you were basically roommates, that there was no intimacy. And I said, we had intimacy, we had a relationship. He was lying to you the same way he was lying to me. And she said, I know that now, and I ended things with him, told him I couldn't trust someone who'd lied for 2 years. And I felt a grim satisfaction that James had lost both of us, that his attempt to keep both relationships had resulted in him losing everything. The annulment process took 3 months, and during that time I had to face everyone who'd kept the secret, had to navigate family dinners, where my mother tried to apologize, and I refused to engage. Had to deal with Catherine and Sarah trying to repair our relationship while I built walls to keep them out. And I realized that James's betrayal had contaminated all my relationships, had made me question everyone's loyalty, had turned me into someone suspicious and guarded. My bridesmaids tried to explain their reasoning, said they'd been scared to tell me, scared I'd shoot the messenger, scared I wouldn't believe them, and I understood the fear, but I couldn't forgive the choice they'd made. Couldn't forgive that they'd valued their comfort over my right to know the truth. And I told them I needed space, needed time to figure out if I could ever trust them again. The annulment was finalized in December, 6 months after the wedding, and the judge granted it on grounds of fraud. And I walked out of that courthouse feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I was no longer legally bound to James. Heavier because I was facing the reality of being a divorced woman at 32. Of explaining to people that my marriage had lasted 6 months. Of carrying the humiliation of having been the last to know about my husband's affair. James tried to stay in touch, sent me emails saying he was in therapy, saying he understood why he'd done what he'd done, saying he hoped someday I could forgive him, and I blocked his email and his phone number and his social media because I didn't want his explanations, didn't want his growth journey, just wanted him gone from my life completely. I kept the raw wedding footage, couldn't bring myself to delete it even though watching it was painful, because it was evidence of what I'd survived, proof that I'd been lied to not just by my husband, but by everyone I trusted. And sometimes when I was feeling particularly masochistic, I'd watch it and listen to the whispered conversations and feel the rage all over again. And my therapist said this wasn't healthy, said I needed to let go of the anger. But I said the anger was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart, was the thing protecting me from grief. And she said eventually I'd need to grieve, but for now anger was okay, was a stage in the process. 6 months after the annulment, I started dating again. Nothing serious, just coffee dates and dinners, trying to remember what it felt like to trust someone. And on every first date I had the same conversation, had to explain that I'd been married briefly, had it annulled, and watch men's faces as they decided whether my baggage was too heavy. And some of them never called again, and some of them stuck around long enough to hear the full story. And most of them said things like, "That's crazy," or "I can't believe people would do that." And I'd think, yeah, I couldn't believe it either until it happened to me. I went on a date with someone who seemed promising, a guy named Ryan who was kind and funny and asked good questions. And when I told him about the annulment, he said, "Wait, everyone at your wedding knew your husband was cheating and no one told you." And I said, "Yep, that's correct." And he said, "That's not just betrayal by your husband, that's betrayal by your whole community." And hearing someone else name it that way, hearing someone understand the scope of what had happened, made me cry right there in the restaurant. And Ryan didn't run away, just handed me napkins and said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. You deserved better." I eventually forgave my mother, not because what she did was okay, but because she was my mother and I needed family. And she'd apologized genuinely and repeatedly. And she'd done the work to understand why her choice had been wrong. And I could see she carried guilt about it. And my therapist said forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing. It just means releasing the hold that resentment has on you. And I released it slowly, painfully, but I released it. I never forgave Catherine or Sarah or any of the bridesmaids. Told them we could be friendly if we ran into each other, but we'd never be close again. And they'd have to live with the consequences of their choice to stay silent. And Catherine sent me a long letter a year after the annulment saying she understood, saying she'd make the same choice if she could do it again. And I appreciated the honesty, even if it confirmed that our friendship was over. 2 years after the annulment, I ran into Jennifer at a coffee shop. We recognized each other, and there was this awkward moment where we both froze. And then she walked over and said, "Emma, I just want to say again that I'm sorry for my part in what happened." And I said, "I appreciate that." And we talked briefly, and she told me she was engaged to someone new, someone who'd never lied to her, and I was happy for her in a detached way because her happiness didn't affect me anymore. And she said, "I hope you found happiness too." And I said, "I'm working on it." And that was true. I was working on it every day in therapy and in my new relationship with Ryan and in my career that I'd thrown myself into. And happiness wasn't constant, but it was possible again, which was more than I'd thought in those first months after everything fell apart. 3 years after the annulment, I married Ryan in a tiny ceremony with just his family and my mother. No bridesmaids, no big reception, just a simple exchange of vows with people who'd earned the right to be there. And when Ryan promised to be faithful, I believed him because he'd spent 3 years proving his character, proving that his words and actions aligned, proving that he was nothing like James. And I felt safe with him in a way I'd never felt safe with James even before I knew about the affair. The wedding videographer we hired was not Rebecca, though I'd stayed in touch with her. Had sent her a thank you note after the annulment saying her decision to show me the raw footage had saved me from wasting more years on a lie. And she'd written back saying she was glad she'd told me, glad I'd had the courage to walk away. And I thought about courage a lot, about how it takes courage to end something you've invested in, courage to admit you made a mistake, courage to start over. And I'd had to find reserves of courage I didn't know I had. Looking back now 4 years after the wedding that wasn't really a wedding, I can see that the raw footage was a gift even though it felt like a curse. Can see that Rebecca's decision to break the fourth wall and tell me what she'd heard saved me from years of living in a lie. And I'm grateful to her in a way I'll never be able to fully express. Grateful that one person in my life chose truth over comfort, chose my right to know over social niceties, chose to risk my anger by telling me something I needed to hear. The betrayal destroyed my trust in people for a while, made me suspicious and guarded, made me question everyone's motives. But it also taught me that trust has to be earned, not assumed, that people showing you who they are should be believed the first time, that loyalty is about action, not words. And I carry those lessons into every relationship now, personal and professional, and they've made me stronger even if the learning was brutal. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Rebecca hadn't sent me the raw footage, if I'd just watched the pretty edited version and never known about the whispered conversations. And I think I would have found out eventually, because affairs don't stay secret forever. Jennifer would have gotten tired of waiting, or James would have slipped up, or someone would have felt guilty enough to tell me. But I would have wasted more time, maybe had children with James. Maybe built a life so entangled that leaving would have been even more complicated. And in that way, the raw footage was perfectly timed, was the intervention I needed exactly when I needed it. I don't watch the footage anymore, packed it away in a box in storage with other remnants of that failed marriage. The dress I'll never wear again, the photos I couldn't bring myself to destroy but couldn't stand to see, the gifts we never returned, and that box is closed and I don't plan to open it. But knowing it exists feels important, feels like having evidence that I'm not crazy, that it really happened the way I remember, that I really was betrayed by everyone around me, and I really did survive it and come out stronger. The wedding video taught me that what you see on the surface is never the whole story, that behind every perfect smile and beautiful moment, there might be whispered secrets and hidden betrayals. And while that knowledge makes me more cynical, it also makes me more careful. Makes me pay attention to actions, not words. Makes me trust my instincts when something feels off. Makes me question narratives that seem too perfect, because perfect is often performance and performance hides truth. And I'd rather have uncomfortable truth than comfortable lies. And I know that now in a way I didn't before. And that knowledge cost me a marriage and several friendships, and my innocence about people's capacity for deception. But it also gave me clarity and strength, and the ability to walk away from situations that don't serve me. And those gifts, painful as they were to receive, are worth every moment of heartbreak it took to learn them.